So today, in our series, we're pleased to welcome Catriona Sandilands, who is the Canada Research Chair in Sustainability and Culture in the Faculty of Environmental Studies at York University. Her research areas include environmental cultural studies and environmental literatures, as well as environmental politics and cultural studies. And her publications are numerous, including many articles and essays that you're probably familiar with, as well as the book, The Good-Natured Feminist, Ecofeminism and the Quest for Democracy. And she's also co-editor of Queer Ecologies, Sex, Nature, Politics, and Desire, which came out from Indiana a couple of years ago. And I'll say about Kate's work, what's so phenomenal about it, among, including the rigor of it, is that she effectively has created, with a few others, a field, a new field of inquiry for us, and it's quite extraordinary. And more recently, she's been working in the areas of the dynamics of gender, sexuality, nation, and place, including an ongoing research project on the cultural history of Canada's national parks, and on the intersections between sexual and environmental histories and politics, which she calls queer ecologies. And she's going to be talking to us today about this work. Her paper this afternoon is called Botanically Queer, which many people have asked us about. It's a quite intriguing title, and we're pleased to welcome you and to hear your work. Thank you very much.
Thank you so much for having me. It's a great honor to be asked to speak here, and I'm absolutely thrilled. I had thought I would speak for 40 to 45 minutes, which means that I may not get through my, as usually, overambitious agenda, but some of the things that I don't get to, I'm sure, will come up in the discussion. An enormous amount of recent discussion has taken place in the last 8 years about the ways in which so-called queer animals complicate heteronormative assumptions about sexuality and also bring queer questions into the realm of biology, materiality, and ecology. This has occurred in evolutionary biology, notably the work of Paul Vasey, who argued very persuasively against the generally reproductive teleology that is used to organize discussions of mammalian sexuality. There is, in his mind, no evidence whatsoever that female macaque same-sex eroticism has anything to do with lubricating female sociality toward heterosexual sexual acts. In probably about 2000, there were two very, very large books that came out, one by Bruce Bagnall and one by Joan Roughgarden, that very carefully enumerated a wide variety of different kinds of queer sexual practice, their terms, that they saw within the animal kingdom. Everything ranging from Canada geese engaging in ménage à trois to a fair bit of partner swapping and a whole variety of different kinds of fish. Evidence drawn from animal study is used toward a variety of ends. As Jennifer Terry notes, animals help us tell stories about ourselves. And so it's no surprise that in the midst of struggles over same-sex marriage, particularly in the United States, animals such as the putatively gay penguins, Roy and Silo, and the Toronto ones were named Buddy and Pedro, so we had our own little drama going on. Became subjects of pitched ideological battles, both when they became couples and subsequently parents, and then again when those familial relations later transformed into something else that wasn't quite so amenable to a neat little story about life pair bonding and nuclear family parenting. While popular media and same-sex marriage advocates may be focused on these charismatic, megafaunal displays of homonormativity, try Googling queer animals and you'll get a roster of cuddling giraffes, bunnies, chimps, wolves, and lions, with the occasional stacked squirrel or deer ménage à trois, just to keep things a little bit interesting. Some scholars are finding much more complicated sexual stories in notions of biological queerness. Myra Hurd, for example, has written quite prolifically about queer and trans animals, in the process documenting a staggering diversity of sexual forms, gendered embodiments, and reproductive possibilities. Not only is queer animality ubiquitous, occurring in over 450 different species of animals in every geographic region of the world, in every major animal group, in all age groups, and with equal frequency amongst males and females and others, but also stable sexual gender dimorphism is far from the only possibility for gendered embodiment out there. Intersexuality is numerous in too many forms to document. Many organisms move from one kind of sexed body to another under different environmental conditions, at different points in their lifespans, and in relation to the gender of other species members. And still other organisms take on specific behaviors or characteristics of other genders in order to fool predators, have sex, or impress the social competition. As Elizabeth Wilson notes, the point of all this polymorphous perversity is not to naturalize any given human expression of sexual embodiment or identity, as we saw so clearly with Roy, Silo, Buddy, and Pedro, but to call into question arguments about authenticity, embodiment, identity, and even technology, on which more conventionally human-centered arguments about sexuality currently rest. What Stacy Limo calls eluding capture. Referring to the complex intersex and multi-partner life of many of the species of barnacle that were the subject of Charles Darwin's studies, to think of non-human animals as queer in a conventional term is too glib. Barnacles have a really wild sex life. As Wilson writes, instead, the characterization of barnacles and others as queer has much more punch if it is used contrariwise to render those familiar human cultural and social forms more curious as a result of their affiliation with barnacle organization. The queerness of Darwin's barnacles is salutary not because it renders the barnacle knowable through its association with familiar human form, but because it renders the human, cultural, and social guises of queer less familiar and more captivated by natural and biological forces. It is in this spirit, then, that I ask about botanical queerness. Specifically, what I'd like to do in this presentation is investigate some of the ways in which plants, vegetal modes of being and becoming, and specific plants in relation to specific human institutions suggest possibilities of life and relationship that render the human, cultural, and social guises of queer less familiar, and in doing so, expose some of the ways in which paying attention to plants offers up reflections on modes of being, becoming, living, and futurity that have been overlooked in many more animal-centric accounts of life, and also of biopolitics. These may serve as the basis of a more critical, queer, and ecological understanding of life in relation to sex and power. Of course, there's any number of ways that I could approach this discussion, invoking as it does a very rich terrain of what I might now call new queer materialisms. By way of Karen Barad's use of the concept of queer performativity to develop an account of the co-constitutive materialization of organisms at the cellular as well as the organismic level. By way of Claire Colebrook's fascinating Deleuzian-inspired account of queer vitalism as a way of considering life forces of composition that are antithetical to already constituted images of life as necessarily fruitful, generative, organized, and human. Or by way of Eva Hayward's beautiful account of becoming with starfish that elegantly dances with echinoderms in order to think metaphorically about changing trans embodiments and also metonymically about potential transspeciations. What I'm going to do in this presentation, however, is begin more particularly in the emerging interdisciplinary field of critical plant studies in order to think with the specificity of plants and vegetality as against a more general focus on life, vitality, animacy, or material agency. I'd like to divide my remarks, and they are very much experimental remarks, into three sections. In the first, Strange Vegetalities and Desiring Plants, I'll use the work of Theresa May, Michael Marder, Karen Poole, and Diane Chisholm to consider the ways in which plants, histories, philosophies, and communications call us to radically rethink how we humans coexist with plants in the world, replacing our almost unthinking biopolitical instrumentalization of plant life with a focus on desiring plants as an invitation to an alternate queer ecology. In the second, Queer Life and Vegetal Transgression, I'd like to consider ways in which considering plant lives hold potential particularly to complicate heteronormative understandings of identity, kinship, temporality, and futurity. In other words, I will engage plants alongside Edelman, Halberstam, Munoz, and Chisholm in order to explore vegetal possibilities for forms of life that are not redeemed in repro-capitalist narratives of advancement, accumulation, generation, and development. Finally, in queer plant becomings, I'd like to touch more casually, and to the extent that I have time, on a few queer botanical encounters that begin to stage and demonstrate what these complicated affinities might look like. Mary Delaney's and Derek Jarman's Queer Gardens, and Shani Mutu's and Larissa Lai's Queer Fictions of Queer Botanical Kinship. Critical plant studies is an emerging, as yet rather amorphous field that takes inspiration from critical animal studies and from new materialist thought, exploring ways in which plants are important parts of biopolitical configurations, as in actor network theory and other works in cultural geography and anthropology that treat multi-species relationships. For example, the work of Cloak Jones, Hitchings, and Anna Singh. I'm cheating there. Anna Singh actually writes about mushrooms, which aren't plants, but close enough. Second, critical plant studies explores ways in which plants are historically and spatially important players in the economics, politics, and knowledge relations of, for example, colonialism, romanticism, modernism, and neoliberalism. These works include Teresa Kelly, Londa Schiebinger, Rusty Steyer, and Catherine Phillips. Critical plant studies also considers that plants are forms of life that are good to think with, as in philosophical reflections on the nature of living, vegetality, soul, and or complicated distinctions between Zoe and Bios. For example, Elaine Miller, Michael Marder, and Karen Pohl. Critical plant studies also generally considers that plants are sensing, communicating, evolving, and profoundly active agents in the ongoing negotiation of multi-species relations and environmental conditions. For example, biologist Daniel Chamowitz, popular writer Michael Pollan, and plant neurologist, that's a very contested term, Stefano Mancuso, championing of the emerging field of plant signaling or plant signaling or plant neurobiology, depending on how controversial one is going to be in the midst of intransigent scientific conservatism. And finally, plant studies also include the notion that plants are important material and imaginative resources for biocentric and or ecological thought that connects biology with ontologically speculative eco-criticism and environmental history. For example, in the works of Joni Adamson, Anthony Loy, and Annie Ingram. That sounded like a very neat little list, but of course there's also there are many intersections between critical plant studies and ethnobotany, which is a much older tradition which looks at particularly indigenous people's uses of plants, and the complex cosmologies of plants in which plants are involved. There have also been many cultural studies of agriculture and gardening and environmental histories that are very, very much aware of the role of plants in the role of plants in ecological imperialism, for example. And there are also even even more popular works of natural history take as their object this very interesting critical reflection on the agency of plants. So, yes, there's this new thing called critical plant studies. It's been around in a variety of different forms, and it's going to continue to take a variety of different forms because the knowledge of that plants are part of cultural politics is, for some groups of people, a no-brainer. Gardeners, botanists, foresters, etc. It's absolutely clear that plants have cultural politics. But one thing that critical plant studies does, one thing that critical plant studies I think does add, partly because of its attachment to or emergence in response to critical animal studies is the sense that there is an emerging ethical imperative. So not just how do we talk about plants, but how do we think about developing right relationships to plants. I will come back to that a little bit at the end if you like. But it was very much exemplified in, I'm not sure how many of you saw it, a recent article by Michael Pollan wrote for the New Yorker called The Intelligent Plant, which was really an overview of a whole bunch of literature on plant signaling, which I will talk about a little bit. But it very clearly ended with a sense that this notion of plant intelligence means that we need to treat plants a little bit better. And that moment gets actually very, very sticky because how do we know how a plant wants to be treated better ends up being a very complicated thing. There was, in addition, a very public debate between Michael Marder and animal rights scholar Gary Francione over the concept of plant rights, in which Francione was absolutely categorically opposed to any notion that plants have rights because plants don't suffer. There are some of the plant signaling folks are saying, well, that's not necessarily the case. We don't know what suffering is. We don't know what suffering is. But Francione dug in his heels, and as far as he's concerned, plants are not able to be subject to the life. Therefore, they should not be accorded moral consideration. The only reason that we should think about limiting plant consumption is because we would get fat if we eat too many. This struck me as a slightly paranoid response. Like the tension between critical animal studies and the animal rights movement, there is a tension between understanding the complex, historically active, and ongoing involvement of plants in the world and the moral, ethical, and political frameworks we have in place through which to imagine and institutionalize less exploitative or simply more aware and responsive versions of those involvements. I'm not going to solve these issues here. I will, however, be paying particular attention to plants as living beings in order to attempt to preserve the sense that there are deeply ethical and political questions involved in queer botanical conversations, questions that draw from both queer critiques of heteronormative configurations of life and plant-derived ones about the overlooked and or subversive potential of vegetality and of specific plants. To begin historically, Teresa Kelly's really remarkable book, you should run out and buy it immediately, it's absolutely wonderful. Clandestine Marriage, Botany and Romantic Culture, traces some of the ways in which plants were key actors in romantic culture. During the period of imperial botany, taking particular shape in the late 16th and 17th century, strange plants were brought back to Europe that had the effect of profoundly confounding emerging taxonomic systems. Botanist James Wallace called them legions of monstrous plants. The Foucauldian narrative, the sort of generally understood Foucauldian narrative in the order of things, is that there was a rupture in understanding of plants, or plants in particular, between the 16th century focus on the doctrine of signatures, in which the hidden quality of the plant, the person interpreting the plant was looking for the hidden quality that gave the sign of what the plant was going to, how the plant was going to act as a healing agent. So somehow we were supposed to decode the clue with the signature that told us how the plant was supposed to be used. So according to Foucault, there's a rupture between the 16th century doctrine of signatures and the 18th century, particularly the Linnaean invention in Species Plantarium, for categorically systematizing plants, and then from the plants, all living beings, based on visible and organizable differences of relationships. His first version was kingdom, class, order, genus, species, and it has been almost infinitely proliferated since then. Phylum, subphylum, megaclass, microclass, which actually tells you something about what happens to taxonomic systems when things start getting complicated. These Linnaeus' classificatory system was hotly contested and later supplanted by Darwinian evolutionary views. But we still live with Linnaean binomial nomenclature, and in fact with many of the names that we originally gave to plants. Not to mention with the idea that plants can be slotted into a global system and find a precise place in a tree or a map, or an evolutionary diagram of what plant belongs where as a result of what traits. According to Kelly, plants have always given such classificatory practices the slip, despite attempts to corral them into groups and or derive profit from their properties as members of particular species or genera. First, the sheer number and monstrosity of plants brought back was part of the rupture that fueled taxonomic debate. There was so much coming back, and there was so much interest in what these plants could possibly be, that they actually fueled quite a passionate scientific debate about Linnaean versus Linnaean versus natural systems taxonomies. And it was very much about which properties of the plants were the ones along which the comparisons and categorizations were going to be made. Second, plant secrecy remained at the heart of the classification. As Kelly notes, in the Linnaean system, 23 classes of plants were based on were organized based on the number of stamens or stamina. Within each of those classes, the number and arrangement of pistils determined the order of the plant, together comprising what he thought of as the sexually hierarchical marriage that gave the plant identity in the system. So, of course, the male is the superordinate category, the female is the subordinate category. But together they have particular marriages, and the nature of that marriage, the relationship between stamen and pistil, was what allowed him to divide it into 23 of 24 groups. The 24th category he called cryptogamia, which means hidden, and he considered that this form of marriage was a clandestine marriage. And this category included ferns, mushrooms, lichens, and algae. And therefore, the precise identity, the precise sexuality of this class of plants remained unknown. So it was always a kind of amorphous thing that logically, of course, disrupted the ability of the whole categorization system to make sense. It's like having other as a meaningful category. So we call it, by calling it cryptogamia, he sort of capped the ability of the plant to disrupt the entire system, kind of contained in secret. Third, writes Kelly, regimes of visibility clashed, the scientific regimes of visibility clashed with aesthetic, horticultural, and other plant experiences as the plants themselves, and not just the categories, entered into popular culture by way of amateur practices of collecting and identifying plants, and also, I would add, emerging practices of botanical display and show gardening that put plants together in ways that were not only about categorical order. So at the same time, as you have this politics of visible categorization, you also have another politics of visible display, which is based on a very different understanding of order, and it's also based on an understanding of the pleasure of the garden, the beauty of the garden, the aesthetics of the garden. So there was always this really interesting interplay between the materiality of the plant and the essence of the plant, even at that moment. Fourth, residues of the excessive hidden materiality of plants were present in other elements of Romantic culture. The popularity of botany and the availability of botanical illustration botany was the thing to do at the time. It was even the thing for women to do at the time. And if we get to be able to talk about Mary Delaney, that gets very, very interesting. But botany was the disputed middle kingdom between inert forms, minerals, and animals, and offered a conduit into some of Romanticism's most persistent inquiries, beginning with the nature of nature and of life, and including the debate about whether nature or spirit should dominate, the global market of commodity plants, the relation between scientific inquiry and aesthetic pleasure, and the epistemological value accorded to concepts and particulars, for example, in the well-known debates between Goethe and Hegel. Plants embody epistemological difficulty and made botany something other and more than the work of imperialism. Hidden even in the folds of that imperial story is a highly nuanced and sustained recognition that plants invite notice of an excess that is by turns material and imaginative, natural. Michael Marder, a philosopher, begins from a very different place, but has a similar sense of giving us, a similar sense of showing the ways that plants give us the slip. And he's actually very comfortable with the idea that plants should give us the slip, because in those moments that plants that we attempt to visualize and represent plants, it ends up often not being very good for the plant, and it ends up profoundly misrepresenting, usually in a very standard hierarchical order, the nature of vegetality. He begins with the premise that the uses to which we put plants and the categories into which we place them does not exhaust what or who plants are, but rather obfuscates enormous regions of their being. Against both nominalism, i.e. this taxonomic system, and conceptualism, i.e. Hegel, development of an aesthetic hermeneutic relationship to plants that attempts to think with plants in order to develop a mode of plant thinking that both connects us to them and allows their alterity to persist. The eventful encounter with plants, whereby we find our greatest proximity to them, he writes, without negating their otherness, cannot come to pass unless we entertain the hypothesis that vegetal life is coextensive with a distinct subjectivity with which we might engage, and which engages us more frequently than we imagine. This is a very subtle and complex book that takes us from Aristotle to Nietzsche and all over the place, so clearly I'm not going to be able to summarize it here. But one key argument concerns the particularity of plant corporeality in relationship to animal corporeality. Plants begin in the middle with a seed, stretching upward and downward simultaneously. This delights Marder because it defies both idealism and materialism. And more importantly, plants are heteronomous, meaning that they are both spatially and temporally radically dependent on something other than themselves. Their growth, where, when, how much, in what direction, is a result of the influences of sun and soil, and not so much the result of the unfolding of an inner principle, which is at least what we like to think that human subjectivity is about. Vegetal life does not, he writes, contain its cause in itself, in contrast to the animal, which harbors the principle of its own animation. The plant does not stand under the injunction to cordon itself off from its surroundings, to negate its connections to a place, so that it can fully become itself as a consequence of this oppositional stance. In addition, plants are not singularities in the same way as animals, although the singularity in animals is itself subject to debate. But within Western metaphysics, again, we like to think we are. Plants are not organisms consisting of interdependent organs orchestrated by a single overarching telos, and should not be conceived as a totality or differentiated whole in their own right. Of course, he cannot help but comment on Deleuze and Guattari here. Plants are exemplary bodies without organs. And yet, Deleuze and Guattari get the trees completely wrong, forgetting that leaves are not elements of the larger whole. They are the source, the product, and the minute reproduction of vegetal being from which it may at any time fall away. I will come back to them in a moment. So plants not only disrupt our sense of stable order, but also our sense of stable self. Plants are collective beings whose bodies are non-totalizing assemblages of multiplicities. and are also radically dependent entities whose beings are dispersed into their environments. Indeed, plants are, even at the level of everyday human experience, both beings and environments. These traits show us things about ourselves. In a very provocative essay, oddly enough in the Journal of Critical Animal Studies, Karen Gould wrote a piece called Animal, Vegetable, Mineral, Ethics as Extension or Becoming. And unlike Martyr, although she is a philosopher, she engages very seriously with some of the contemporary research on plant signaling. To make a case for a different kind of understanding of identity and intimacy as a radically collective achievement. To be brief, plants communicate via something called volatile organic compounds. We've all experienced a volatile organic compound, either walking past a rose, or smelling a skunk cabbage, or putting your when your grandmother taught you to put the unripe avocado in the bag with the ripe banana, and that would ripen the avocado. That's because of the ethylene that's given off from the banana. It's actually very effective. So that's one little example of plant communication. Plants tell other plants when to ripen. So plants communicate via volatile organic compounds, which are made up of hundreds of different chemicals. Any given plant has a set of VOCs sort of going on an everyday basis, and when it becomes stressed in any way, or when its environment changes in any way, by being eaten, by being shaded, by being thirsty, by being perhaps even overabundantly fed, its chemical profile will change. The chemical profile is often unique to an individual plant, i.e. the plant is not acting as a generic member of a species or a type. And even in an individual plant, the volative profiles change differently depending on the kind of stress involved, which means, in essence, that they are co-evolving with their stressors. So the stress changes, the plant changes. The stress changes, the plant changes. This kind of responsiveness is just not something that we're used to thinking about regarding plants, unless we are avid gardeners or other people who sort of place themselves in these kinds of intimate relationships. Even more, if one kind of plant experiences one kind of stress, its volatile profile can signal to an entirely different kind of plant to improve the latter's success, i.e. it's signaling not to kin, but to neighbors. For example, when sagebrushes are cut, getting off a particular set of VOCs, it induces resistance in wild tobacco, which is what that is, to cutworms. And several studies have shown no particular benefit to the sagebrush. Cool sort of offers that this is like a very, that this kind of behavior is a very Levinasian affects for a plant to be behaving in. For pollinator relations, in addition, flower volatiles are not simple what she calls a one-note info spritz aimed directly at a single wasp, but rather the perfume emitted by the host plant and perceived by insect contains information not only about the identity of the plant, but its developmental stage, receptivity, ripeness. And some of these exchanges, as some plants move from being pollinated by one organism to another over the course of a season, or in response to stress or scarcity, are even more complicated. Finally, plants communicate across kingdoms. These same tobacco flowers, when threatened with an overabundance of hawk moth caterpillars, which they register chemically through the caterpillar's saliva, send VOCs into the air to attract another insect, the big-eyed bug, in case you're interested, that feeds voraciously on both the hawk moth eggs and the larvae. When chemically triggered by caterpillar predation, the plants also develop epidermal outgrowths called trichomes that are specifically attractive to caterpillars, but that when eaten, cause the caterpillars to themselves exude the odor that attracts bugs. I wish I could do this. I really wish I could do this. And finally, significant predation also causes the plants to dramatically alter their pollinator relations, switching within a matter of days. So this is not evolutionary time. This is within the lifespan of a plant, and in fact, within a very small amount of the lifespan of a plant. It causes the plants to switch within a matter of days from attracting the hawk moths, which are main pollinator as well as main predator, to attracting diurnal hummingbirds, whose offspring don't eat the plants. In order to do so, the plants come to flower at a different time of day, the shape of the flower changes, and so does the chemical composition of the nectar. Daniel Chanovitz, showing the ways in which plant sensations are frequently based on sensory processes that are remarkably homologous to those that occur in humans. For example, in some cases, the precise chemical or physical processes that it appears to enable a sensory response in a plant is remarkably similar to the one enabling human or other animal response. The laying down of a short-term memory in my brain and yours, when mine is working, is a matter of potassium imbalance and the passage of electrical signals. It's the same thing in a Venus flytrap. That causes the Venus flytrap to be able to close on its prey. It's exactly the same chemical response and exactly the same potassium, chemically induced energy jump that happens between synapses. Similarly, the language of neurobotany, in the language of neurobotany, Mancuso indicates similarities between human and plant communication. Now this is a bit the taste of the Michael Pollan New Yorker article as well. We tend to process this information in anthropocentric terms. Oh, plants are kind of like us, isn't that interesting? Which gives rise to this whole sort of conversation between Francione and Margaret about plant rights. So it's on the basis of their similarity to us that we might consider their moral considerability. For Karen Houle, and one of the reasons why I like this article very, very much, she leads us to a totally different conclusion. She argues that plant becoming radically reimagines life as that which can be accomplished not within a successfully managed organic encasement of what a thing is, its being, its progeny, but as that which can happen by virtue of a certain unfaithful power of connectivity, which is what she sees in this complex web of volatile or organic chemical relations. That plants actually do not demonstrate particular fidelity to kin. They actually have profoundly communicative cross-species relationships, and their senses of becoming and being are very, very much part of how they exist in the world. Also in the register of both air and earth, having mentioned the fungus that are involved in plant communications. So in sum, plants are living beings that expose us to modalities of life that are both obscure and that call into question some of humans' most cherished assumptions about what it means to be alive, not to mention what it means to be a modern bearer of selfhood, identity, agency, and individuality. Simply put, plants are in many respects stupefyingly different from people, but in their difference, they also estrange our own humanity. This radical difference has not served plants particularly well. To quote Martyr, we take plants for granted in our everyday lives. They are literally everywhere, but curiously enough, the absolute familiarity of plants coincides with their sheer strangeness, the incapacity of humans to recognize elements of ourselves in the form of vegetal being, and hence the uncanny nature of our relation to them. It is this uncanny familiarity, I think, that haunts Giorgio Agamben's anthropological machine, in which one crucial operation of biopolitics consists in the iterative struggle over the distinction between zoe and bios, bare life, political life, the natural life of nutrition, growth, and decay, and what is considered meaningfully human. The struggle with the relation between zoe and bios lies, in fact, at the center of the always fraught negotiation of what it means to be human. But the logic of that negotiation is always ex post facto. The idea of the human as a meaningful entity is presupposed on some basis or another, in this, let's say, mobility in this case. and something else understood as not human is then excluded. So because plants lack a certain kind of mobility, they are obviously less alive in the world. Famously, in The Open, Agamben shows that the constant redrawing of this line is a key biopolitical moment in which life is brought to the service of power. In Western culture, life is never defined, but rather ceaselessly articulated and divided. For Agamben, of course, the slippery distinction concerns the one made between humans and mere animals. I'd like to argue that the distinction between vegetality and animality and vegetality and humanity is at least equally important. For plants are so clearly identified with bare life that the possibility that they might possess something other than what Aristotle referred to as mere psychic potentiality is almost impossible to imagine. Animal lives for us generally require something more than mere habitual succession. They require a responsive relationship to an external environment. The research that I just presented, of course, shows that plants are incredibly responsive to their environments. Animal lives for us generally require some kind of rudimentary recognition of self in relation to environment. So it's no accident that Carrie Wolfe, in the midst of a highly nuanced argument about Judith Butler's work on the shared corporeal precarity of humans, animals, and environments, writes that not everything included under the rubric of precarious life, plants, for example, warrants protection from harm. Plants are standing reserve for human desire, and never themselves bearers of desire. For Diane Chisholm, then, it's through a rethinking of desire that we can imagine a more ecological future. Using the work of desert writer Ellen Malloy in conversation with Deleuzean notions of rhizomatic becoming, Chisholm explores what it might mean to pursue oblique affections and couplings across species lines, and in defiance of Linnaean and other reductions of organismic comings to the workings of reproductive organs and the various corporeal and social relations that support those workings, later enshrined in Darwinian understandings of sexual selection. This unprocreative process is one of becoming through creative involution. However much they've misrepresented trees, it's no accident that Deleuze and Guattari chose a plant metaphor to describe this form of erotic affiliation. Plants desire precisely along involutionary lines, and although D&G prefer to speak about becoming's animal, what Chisholm notices in Malloy's writing is the way in which the desert landscape compels her to become a plant. Chisholm quotes Malloy on the visceral seductions of plants. In plant and human worlds, in mountain and desert, red flowers like the snow plant and paintbrush and claret cactus are visual aphrodisiacs. They signal the seasonal shift from dormancy to reproductive frenzy, from the cerebral to the carnal. Red is the color of martyrs, blood, hell, and desire. It quickens the heart and releases adrenaline. Here, of course, one can speak about pollination, but as Chisholm rightly insists, this brazen red sexuality of Malloy's flowers is also an overt invitation to couplings of a different sort. A sideways knowing that gives rise to a multiplicity of erotic encounters that include her own sensations and affections, and that open up a new world of understanding and biophilic connections. To quote Malloy, I curl up inside the bloom of a cactus and think that the sex life of plants is not a simple affair. So many delicate body parts for seduction and consummation: filament, anther, pistil, ovary, stigma, style, a corolla of silky petals to enclose the cusp of love. Here she is intentionally complicated, Linnaeus here. Responding to vegetal seductiveness is, for Malloy, not only about sensual pleasure, but it is also about developing the capacity to explore and affiliate with all life, beyond instrumental appropriations, and beyond notions of understanding and development that rest on narrowly reproductive evolution and individual advancement and achievement. Becoming plant is ethical, ecological necessity. As Chisholm describes, Malloy's brazen plant harlotry is profoundly and overtly queer. Malloy offers a queer paradigm of desire that replaces the apparatus of heterosexual genealogy while embracing other creative variations of becoming life. Of course, this understanding of queer resonates with several others with which I imagine many of you are deeply familiar, notably Leigh Edelman's No Future and the many important works that have responded to and contested, constellated around it, such as Halberstam's Queer Art of Failure and Munoz's Cruising Utopia. For Chisholm, in Edelman's searing critique of the dominant culture of the child and the reproductive futurism that it entails, he inspires dissenting queers who resent the social complicity of breeders and futurists. However, very problematically, he sees life as the ideological enemy that queer desire ought to critically and clinically annihilate, which does nothing toward reimagining queer involvement with life's creative and multiple becoming, that has already exceeded a model futurity limited to mammalian, if not uniquely heterohuman, forms of generationality and capitalist forms of inheritance and accumulation. For Halberstam, similarly, Edelman's absolute commitment to death and finitude is a welcome antidote to optimistic projections of intergenerational inheritance, growth, and abundance, which we can and must link to both homo-nationalism and to the rampant accumulative tendencies of capitalism. At the same time, however, it tends towards structural, empty aestheticism that focuses attention on a very narrow range of sometimes misogynistic expressions and tends to cast material political concerns as crude and pedestrian, as already part of the conjoining of futurity that his project must foreclose. In its place, Halberstam proposes that we need to de-link history and change from a narrow focus on generationality. It is a queer kind of project. This is a queer kind of project. Queer lives seek to uncouple change from the supposedly organic and immutable forms of family and inheritance. Queer lives exploit some potential for a difference in form that lies dormant in queer collectivity, not as an essential attribute of sexual otherness, but as a possibility embedded in a break from conventional heterosexual life narratives. Clearly, this rethinking of life and livability occurs in a somewhat different register from the one Chisholm borrows to such overtly biophilic ends. For her, we are always already enmeshed in queer becomings that exceed generational reproductivity. In a sense, queerness is an ontological property of the world. For Halberstam, queer lives lived against the heterosexist grain are more open to the possibility of recognizing life uncoupled from reprofuturity. Are such queer lives then inherently more open to queer evolutionary possibilities, even to the particular seductions of plant sex? I'm not sure I'm willing to quite go that far. Chisholm alludes to it as a possibility for Malloy. I do, however, think that there are important alliances between and among different forms of queer in the world, in which turning toward a more expansive understanding of desire than reproductive genitality may indeed serve, as Guattari in particular insisted, as a liberation of vitality from the dominant order for both anthropogenic and multi-species queer projects. As Munoz might emphasize, queerness is not quite here. It is a humble potentiality in the midst of loudly proclaimed promises of reproductive majoritarian sexuality. It is an impulse we see in everyday life, glimpsed in utopian bonds, affiliations, designs, and gestures that exist within the present moment. Queer relational bliss is a future unknown collectivity oriented to greater openness to the world, where currently perhaps we are sucked into multi-species assemblages in ways that we do not quite recognize. Perhaps a more concerted attention to looking for life horizontally will help us apprehend the ways in which we are subjects of vegetal desire and respond with openness that such a future unknown collectivity might inspire. But plants also intervene anthropogenically queer projects in quite visible ways in everyday space and time in our lives. For example, in addition to estranging our notions of bodies, selves, and kinship, plants interfere with heteronormative temporalities, the living of life, as Halberstam notes in A Queer Time and Place, according to a narrative inevitably oriented to birth, maturation, adulthood, procreation, retirement, decrepitude, and death. Of course, plants always lie outside anthropocentric notions of time in the sense that their movements, growth, speed, are generally imperceptible in a human time scale without the benefit of time-lapse photography. Some plants live on a much shorter time scale, and others, like ancient trees, on a much longer one, placing them at an arboreal time somewhere between human and rock. Less obviously, however, plants are non-contemporaneous with themselves. As Martyr notes, plants are a loose alliance of multiple temporalities of growth, some of its parts growing faster, others slower, still others decaying and rotting, and in that it does not relate to itself, does not establish a self-identity. To say that a perennial plant, for example, is mature, a favorite phrase of real estate agents selling carefree gardens, is, for example, to impose a linear order on its temporal multiplicity that ignores spent blooms, seed pods, dead branches, new leaves and shoots, and in many temperate climates at least, cyclical bloomings and dying backs. The plant is all of these times at once. Its temporal relationship to itself isn't unified, even as either living or dead. Oak trees are actually mostly dead. All of that beautiful bark that you see is absolutely necessary to the tree. It's incredibly thick. It's actually part of the tree's fire-resistant capacity. The only part of that vast tree that's alive is the very narrow layer. There's the heartwood, there's the cambium, and there's the bark. It's very narrow bit where all the nutrients go. So the bit that we see the liveliness of the tree in the leaves, but it's actually completely enabled by the fact that it is surrounded by death as part of its own being. So the temporality of an oak tree, even though we like to anthropomorphize them, is absolutely different from the temporality of another human body. I'm going to make one more point. The last thing that I want to say, and obviously I'm not going to give any of my examples, the last thing I want to say is that some plants, what I'm saying is that all plants sort of have this residual queerness. There are ways in which plants and thinking about plants and thinking about having relations with plants is actually a very promising way of rescuing life from the bright green version of reproductive futurity that Edelman and Halberstam and Munoz are very critical of, and also that a lot of ecologists are critical of in vastly different ways. So plants are good to think with. Plants are good to have sex with. Plants are good to imagine as kin in interesting kinds of ways, but not just plants are like us, but also the ways in which we are like plants. And plants are things to which, if we pay a little bit more attention to them, we end up learning some pretty extraordinary things about the nature of vegetality and different ways of experiencing time and space and relationships and being rooted in place and nutrition and even the experience of one's body. Cutting off a sunflower's head is not the same as cutting off my head, and that's and it's very difficult to sort of get one's brain around that. So there's this general sense of plants as a whole that suggests something, I think, quite subversively queer that's worth exploring as the basis of an alliance. But there are particular plants as well that I think suggest especially useful alliances. Some plants, in the strangeness of some plants, the excessive vegetality of some plants, is quite easily recontained, and brought back into the service of repro-heterocapitalism. And bee balm is a very interesting example. I have nothing against bee balm. I think it's a very pretty plant. But it's a good plant. It is a plant that we are supposed to be encouraging in our gardens. It is a plant that does good work for us and has historically done good work for us. It is a plant that that behaves like a good plant citizen because it attracts bees, and we're really into bees right now. It is considered indigenous in North America. It is extensively hybridized. It's a very common, it's a relatively common garden plant. It's very hardy. It has many traditional medicinal uses. Industrially, it's actually one of the major ingredients in mouthwash. And you can also, a close cousin of bee balm is wild bergamot, which is not to be confused with the bergamot oranges that they use to flavor Earl Grey tea, but both bee balm and wild bergamot have been used as tea substitutes in the past. Here's the most fascinating piece of trivia that I learned in this entire investigation. Bee balm and bergamot were the things that the colonists drank once they all dumped their tea into the Boston Tea Party. So this is a really American tea. So there's some plants find themselves, like bee balm, find themselves immersed in use value. So it's layer upon layer upon layer upon layer. These are just such unbelievably remarkably good plants. Their capacity to respond to nutritional, medicinal, aesthetic, functional, or other requirements of urban capitalist modernity draws them into economies of human reproduction and accumulation. They're good plants. We help them proliferate. This is sort of the classic biopolitical moment: who is forced to live, who is made to die, who is forced to live. Bee balm is forced to live because it is so terribly productive, and therefore it is hybridized, controlled, proliferated, and gardened intensively in order to produce certain kinds of botanical effects. On the other hand, we have dog strangling vine. Do you have dog strangling vine? No, I was looking for it. I didn't see it. You have tree of heaven. Dog strangling vine is a plant that is absolutely irredeemable. It is considered indigenous to Russia and Ukraine. I wrote this before all of that. It's considered indigenous to Russia and Ukraine, and you can imagine what's going to happen with it. It is considered aggressively invasive in eastern North America, particularly, I guess, in the Great Lakes Basin. It's coming in from the east. It probably is stowaway on the seeds probably came in by accident in a shipment of something else, and it was shipped somewhere else. It is poisonous to livestock and humans, which means that basically nothing can eat it, nothing will eat it. And one of the reasons why it is considered a real problem is that it is a member of the milkweed family, and this is the language of the Ontario Invasive Plant Council, it impersonates milkweed. And the monarch butterflies come along and they lay their eggs on the dog strangling vine. It takes over the milkweed habitats. It lays the eggs on the dog strangling vine, and the dog strangling vine does not provide the monarch eggs with nutrition, and the butterflies never reach the larval state. They did try to make dog strangling vine useful during the Second World War, at least in Canada. They tried to, milkweed has a sort of a rubbery substance, so rather than import rubber, they actually spent quite a bit of scientific research effort trying to find substitute for rubber, so they actually experimented with a wide variety of milkweed-related plants. One of them was dog strangling vine. It failed miserably, and it has the added capacity of the added ability to spread phenomenally quickly. It's not only it's not a parasite, but it uses other plants for scaffolding. So it twirls up other plants, and it outcompetes them for light. And it also it spreads vegetatively, and it also it spreads far too excessively. Its reproduction is far too successful. You don't know what milkweed looks like. So in the fall, you burst open the milkweed pod, and there are these nice, it's called pollinary action, and you have the little white seeds, and the white seeds get carried off. Imagine many, many, many more of them, many much, much, much lighter. And you can imagine how far the dog-strangling vine seeds go. And they have a phenomenally high germination rate. So their reproductivity is excessive. They are also, and one of the reasons why they have made such excellent inroads is that they're wind-borne seeds. So what they love is highways, railways, hiking trails, river valleys, anything that will blow them a long distance, and they can go an incredibly long distance. So these are very unruly, very nasty plants. They're unruly plants. They go too fast, they go too far, they make too many of themselves, they choke out everything else, they don't behave like, they don't behave like sort of independent tree-like things. They require the bodies of others. And most of all, they have absolutely no value to us whatsoever. You can't burn them, you can't eat them. People have tried to weave sculptures out of them, and I think that's a very interesting art project, because it actually sort of shows the non-utility of the plant in the process. But in the absence of this, what I want to argue is that because in human relationships with dog-strangling vine, we do not have the interfering address in the mode of utility, we are forced to recognize the vegetality of the plant. In the absence of use, we encounter it itself. The plant management, the Ontario Invasive Plant Council folks and other plant management people identify it as an aggressive invasive problem and sort of deal with it that way. But the everyday encounter with the plant is not even with, oh, it's pretty, although I think it is pretty, depending on the person. It's not with an instrumental thing about what the plant provides. It's actually with a much rawer experience of the plantness. And in the same way, so I like to think of Lee Edelman and dog-strangling vine kind of in the same register. But this is not about anti-life. This is about a form of life that stubbornly refuses to participate in that kind of logic of reproductive service. Ironically, because it reproduces in a ridiculously, an overly prolific way. This is not about the child. This is not about inheritance. This is about a xenophobically experienced spread of something that is far, far too prolific. So, in conclusion, there are, that's the one on the poster. There are four things that I really want you to get from this discussion. First is that thinking with plants opens up the world to forms of livability that interrupt dominant institutionalized logics of heteronormative reproductivity, generationality, identity, corporeality, temporality, and community, indeed of what it means to be alive, and what it might mean to embrace those parts of ourselves that are more vegetal than animal in the service of new forms of connection. The second is that desiring plant desire in the mode of vegetal becoming is precisely a sideways relation to reproductive futurism, in which becoming plant, or the desire to become plant, indicates modes of eroticism and transformation that are not part of the heterosexual kinship logic and hold the potential to challenge the triad of sex, procreation, and accumulation. Third, although plants are not always already resistant to capitalist forms of appropriation and accumulation, corn is a perfect example, its standing reserve is so hauntingly literal, some plants show us very dramatically forms of generativity that challenge the unquestioned channeling of multiple plant corporealities, temporalities, and networks into hetero-anthropocentric biopolitical agendas of productivity. Dog-strangling vine's refusal to participate in capitalist accumulation is, in this register, quite exciting. It calls into question the perpetual ability of plants to do the reparative work left in the wake of infrastructural developments, where entire ecosystems are picked up, moved around, and redeposited back into places. So fourth then, I would conclude, queering humans and plants are allies. A queer view of plant sexuality draws our eyes away from reproduction, and may, in Munoz's spirit of the opening to the world, give rise to a sexual multiplicity that attends to rhizomatic becomings by which we are surrounded daily. And a plant view of queer sexuality shows models of life, identity, temporality, and community that directly challenge anthropocentric and heteronormative insistences on the child, while shifting attention to forms of generativity, heterotemporality, non-identity, affinity, and community that are a profound challenge to these relations.
Thank you very much. So we have, 25 minutes or so for questions and conversation. So we'll start with a kind of paradox or tension I saw in the paper was that you offer for us that plants are good to think with and have sex with, and they have a kind of theoretical or analytic utility that goes against the grain of you wanting plants not to have utility for us. And I wonder what you might say about that. It's obviously not a capitalist utility, which is what you're most critical of, but we're making them still work for us. In your paper, in a particular sort of way.
Yeah, no, Mark is actually very careful about that. He doesn't want to. He wants to try to practice a vegetal philosophy, hermeneutic, that actually allows the plant to remain in obscurity, even as we can see, even as we might be able to see how touching that vegetal becoming becomes part of, interrupts things. So he's very aware of that tension, and I'm very aware of that tension. The minute dog strangling line has been extraordinarily useful for me. So in talking about its refusal, I somehow legitimate it as part of my contribution to the capitalist knowledge practice.
So along the same lines as Alondra, there's also insisting on the vegetality of the plants, but at the same time, especially toward the end, about the personification of the plants, right? I mean that they, what the dog strangling vine wants is it wants, it likes highways and so on and so forth. So I'm just along the same working today, just refresh a little bit on that.
It's first of all, it's incredibly difficult to talk about plants without anthropomorphizing, and that's just a tension that I've learned to live with it. I don't know what dog strangling wants. Through relatively careful observation, I've seen where it goes and how it moves, and what kinds of light it grows best in. So it's the same attentiveness of a gardener as well. It's the same attentiveness that one takes to gardening. So you might not know exactly what your rose bush wants in that sense, but you can respond to its responses simply through a practice of attention that pays attention as much to its vegetal propensities as to what you want from those vegetal propensities. This is still biopolitics. You're cultivating certain kinds of things. You are watching. It's like flower confession. Like, all right, how are you feeling? There are ways in which you cannot help but organize plant life according to your own desires, or be the interlocutor for the interpretation and expression of plant desires. So by no means do I think I know what Dog Strangenheim wants. But it's interesting nonetheless, and you have to, you know, in thinking about plant-human relations, you have to be willing to dance across the anthropomorphic order. You have no choice. While simultaneously recognizing that all of those attributions of will, for example, could be completely and utterly wrong, because we don't understand the mechanism. We can't necessarily consider the forms of communication to be analogous, and in many cases we simply haven't a clue how it works. It's amazing how little we know about Dog Strangenheim. Yes, please.
So, of course, there is in the history of scientific study of plants, there's a very rigorously non-affective language that critical plant studies is resisting. So, where critical plant studies might say the plant has agency, a traditional biologist would say the plant moves this way, or you know, grows a shield here, whatever. I mean, there are ways of not speaking of plants as if they're having agency, resisting, choosing, and so on. So what I wonder about is why you think that language seems really effective in plant studies. That is, to make plants more like us serves what purpose? That is, to see them as more like us, as having individuality. I think you gave us a list: selfhood, individuality, agency. Why is that valuable? Why would it not be valuable for plants to be really not us?
I don't think plants have individuality and so forth. I think they disrupt our understanding of individuality.
Oh, I'm sorry. Okay, right. I'm sorry. I think that's that. Agency, though, you said.
Agency, yeah, absolutely. Agency being that glorious catch-all term.
It's become very catch-all. Yeah.
Becoming agent, yes. It becomes a glorious term to describe any form of activity that impacts on anything else.
Yeah.
So movement or not movement, breaking or not breaking. You know, these are expressions of agency. One of the reasons that I don't want to just jump into the queer vitality, to speak about this notion of vitality and to describe, or life, or to describe force, relations of force, as some other versions of materialist philosophy do, is that I think there is something valuable in thinking about the ways in which specific bodies and specific organisms and specific machines exert themselves on the world and in response to the world differently. So I'm sorry I let a couple of agencies slip in there, but I actually do really want to talk about plants and the specific ways in which plants do things, which means that you end up having to talk about specific plants. So there's Martyr, whose work I think is absolutely fascinating, but he speaks at a very general level of vegetality, which, when you start thinking about it a little bit more carefully, you realize doesn't necessarily apply equally to all plants. Many of his plants are flowering plants, and well, trees don't necessarily behave that way, and ferns don't behave that way. And there are ways in which some of the categorical statements that he makes about vegetality and the way that plants model certain kinds of things or don't model certain kinds of things or withdraw agencies or exist in multiple temporalities. Some plants don't exist in multiple temporalities. Annuals, come, go, that's it. So I think it is useful to consider the activities of plants in ways that are both, it was a part of a constellation of, but relatively unique parts of the constellation of sort of interacting engagements. Did that answer your question? Is there a mission?
Thank you so much. It's fascinating. I was wondering if you're also interested in the idea or concept of forest and garden, which I think are very different. And it seems like your focus is specific some plants, but you mentioned Derek German's garden, and I want to hear about some of your idea of focus garden, if you like.
Forest. One of the things that one of the projects that I want to engage in, and this is apropos of, this is actually partly a response to your question. I actually far prefer it when I get to talk about particular plants doing particular things in particular places. I want to do some of this conceptual work that ties queer with vegetality. I think it's useful. I think it's a useful intervention into this body of raw body of literature. But I'm happiest when I talk about, you might have noticed, dog stranding in mind. One of the projects that I most want to do, and as a footnote, I find it very interesting that, have you seen the reaction books series, the animal series? So they have like rat, bear, monkey. It's a wonderful series, but they now have a botanical series. So oak, lily, fir, geranium, the ones that I've read. And they actually take the species, they take the species in specific historical circumstances as the basis of the conversation, rather than an abstract notion of plant. So it's about a particular species that have particular social relations, particular ecological niches, particular histories of transportation, etc., etc., etc. To actually answer your question, the project that I most want to engage in is a study of Douglas fir trees. I'm from the west coast of Canada. Douglas fir trees were the basis of the BC logging industry. They are also intimately, Douglas fir trees are actually some of the tree, although I'm pretty sure that most trees will end up having this capacity. Douglas fir trees are able to communicate with each other below the ground by way of fungal networks. They have specific mycorrhizal networks that allow both fir and non-fir trees to communicate with one another about nutrient needs, etc., etc. Douglas fir trees also are the keystone species for any number of birds and large mammals, small mammals, nematodes. They are part of the Douglas fir tree. The unique way that Douglas fir trees grows and in relation to each other are actually shape the way that the rivers flow. In particularly when you get out of the mountains and into more low-lying areas. So there are ways in which that is an invitation to be able to consider the influence of the individual plant socially, culturally, historically, politically, in the context of a version of the forest that is not just about the uses to which we put the forest, and a version of the forest that recognizes that the forest is not a unified thing. It's actually a very complicated, multi-species communicative web. And the size of the Douglas forest, the size of the Douglas fir trees, also, the girth and the size of the Douglas fir trees also gave rise to particular technological relations, particular social relations of logging, particular gender relations of logging, so that the trees are a really interesting way of cementing that much larger and more layered and complicated discussion.
Did I understand correctly that you sort of consider bee balm to be less queer than dog strangling vine? And what is your definition of queer?
Absolutely. I think that dogs. I think that to be precise, the argument is that dogs. That bee balm. We see bee balm through any number of layers of utility. We see it as tool. We see it as mouthwash. We see it as pollinator friendly. We see it as good garden citizen. We see it as nice high plant to put in the back of your garden that isn't invasive. So we tended to see some plants more easily than others in the mode of utility. I think that when we stop seeing plants in the mode of utility, we start being able to see the queerness of plants. So is the bee balm essentially less queer than is the bee balm less queer? No.
It depends on what queer is.
Well, I'm arguing that there is a quality of vegetality that is queering. There's a quality of the way in which plants grow, the way in which they communicate, the way in which the way in which they experience time and identity that is pretty queer, and that it is our inability to see that because we insist on jamming plants into certain kinds of largely instrumentalized relations. And it's only when those instrumentalized relations somehow break down that we begin to see something, that we begin to see the wildness, the queerness of the plant outside of the mode of address in stem and reserve.
So queerness is somehow a refusal to, or something just not falling into the mainstream reproductive paradigm, or what is it?
I think that's part of it. I think I gave several different definitions of queer. Queer is a form of livability, an incitement to livability that does not follow into the paradigm of heterosexual reproductive futurism that we associate, that we tend to naturalize as the way of the future. It's actually, it's part of ecological discourse as well. This is one of the reasons why I find it most striking, is that this, we need to save the earth for the children, gets in the way of the kinds of horizontal relationships that I think are equally natural, equally generative, equally about life, but they are not part of this reprodominant narrative. And I think plants help us see forms of life that are not part of that narrative.
And then if we look at their propensity to reproduce asexually, which a lot of them do, they also fall outside of that paradigm.
Yep, but a lot of animals do that too.
Yes. Not as many as plants, but in general.
But yes, plants are we do it in the dark too.
Good time for maybe one more question.
In a similar way that you began with notions of homonormativity that are now sort of being imposed, or that are the main ways that narratives of queer animals circulate, could you look sort of down the path that, do you think that a similar kind of homonormative gloss could apply to some of the queer dynamics of plants that you're talking about?
Yeah.
And then how might we counter that?
Yep. I think we're a long way away from that. I mean, how many people really care about vegetality? You never know. I think that there are ways in which plants are already part, I googled queer plants just to see if there was something interesting out there. And what there was a lesbian organic food service in, I think, Los Angeles. And I thought that was terribly, terribly interesting because there's nothing, it's absolutely nothing to do with plants other than plants as food. So plants become resources for a homonormative project. And in fact, the injunction that we need to eat more of them and fewer animals means that we are intensifying the way that they directly feed that project. Each year, we're telling your kid to eat broccoli. But I think that conceptually, that slippage is inevitable. There's bound to be a way. I have yet to see a way out of capital. I have yet to see a form of thought that has managed to maintain its alterity, managed to maintain its resistance to the tendency toward incorporation and accumulation. And I imagine that we've got museums devoted to queer animals. I imagine that queer plants are going to use them.
So allow the queer plants to be the last word. Please join me in thanking Kate Sandilands for
Thank you very much for having me.